Hello, welcome to this episode of the Triple F podcast. You notice that over the recent years, corporate America seems to be taking the woke side in the culture wars, and they're leaving the American citizens behind, and the Constitution doesn't really protect our rights against corporate America. So, what can we actually do about that? Well, we're going to talk to Jeremy Tedesco of Alliance Defending Freedom today about the ADF Viewpoint Diversity Score Business Index. So hang on, we'll be right back to introduce Jeremy. Hey, Eva. Today we're going to talk with Jeremy Tedesco from ADF about this really interesting Viewpoint Diversity Score Business Index. That's a mouthful. Let's welcome Jeremy. Jeremy, come on in, tell us about it.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate you covering this. So the Viewpoint Diversity Score project is housed at viewpointdiversityscore.org. So that's where you can go to find a business index that we put together that benchmarks corporations, 50 major Fortune 500 corporations, on their respect for religious and viewpoint diversity. Basically, the respect for free speech and religious freedom. And so we did a study over the last 10 or 11 months. We compiled all the data. We put it through a 42 question scoring matrix that we think fairly and objectively measures whether these corporations respect free speech and religious freedom. And then we gave them scores. And so that's at viewpointdiversityscore.org. You can go there and see the 50 companies. We focused on big tech and financial services for one primary reason, and that is they pose the greatest threat to free speech and religious freedom from a corporate standpoint. We have, a concentration of power within the hands of just a few businesses in those sectors. And so, if just a couple of them start adopting policies that are censorious, that they use to restrict speech or punish people because of their religious or political viewpoints, it really affects the whole sector, and it affects people in ways that are very different, at least than the normal situations we find in these arenas where the government is responsible for that kind of discrimination. Because when private actors are responsible for that kind of discrimination, it's a very different solution to the problem. You can't just file a lawsuit under the First Amendment saying they're violating your free speech rights or your religious freedom rights. And there are legal paths to trying to hold them accountable for some of these things, but we believe that we, as a kind of conservative religious movement, need to hold these corporations accountable to some of the baseline essential values that define the American constitutional experiment.
So, we know from the NFL taking a knee when the national anthem is played, or the Major League Baseball moving out of Georgia because they didn't like some election stuff, but that's all public. What you guys are doing is looking behind the curtain at the internal information about these companies, right?
Yeah, well, we look at internal and publicly available information. So we source the data for the survey, or for the index, by sending a survey to about 100 corporations. We ultimately scored 50. We'll grow this over the years. This is an annual index, so it'll come out every year. But we sent a survey to about 100 companies asking about things that are just internal policies and practices that we're not going to be able to find online. Policies and practices that tell us, how do they treat their customers? How do they treat their workforce? How do they engage in the broader public square when it comes to these issues, free speech and religious freedom? And then we also did an exhaustive review of the publicly available information. And there's quite a bit of that data available, but certainly not all of it. And when you really want to get deep on how they treat, for instance, their employees on these issues, but even some of their customer-based, market-based policies, you really need them to disclose and be transparent about what they're doing. And I think it's very telling that our first year out, of the 50 companies we scored, we only had 2 give us substantive responses to the survey we sent. But I actually think that that's pretty good. I was surprised that anybody responded. 2 is a start, and we got to build on that. Not surprisingly, the 2 organizations that responded got the highest scores, 1 and 2, on the index. because transparency matters on the index. If you're transparent, you get a higher score. If you're revealing this information to us, you're going to have a much stronger likelihood of getting a better score on the index.
So what were
So,
Jeremy, what was
go ahead.
what was the name of the companies, the two that responded?
They were Paychex and Truist, which is kind of a bank conglomerate. They actually have been buying up a bunch of smaller banks, and they operate under the umbrella corporation called Truist. So we are, very excited about continuing the process. We're going to engage with companies this year and try to make it important to them to respond to the survey. One thing to note is that these companies constantly are replying to kind of left-wing activist organizations' demands for transparency, for
that's what I was wondering, because
yeah,
it seems like all of these companies would have their stock ownership publicly traded. Is that right?
Yes, these are all publicly traded companies.
Okay, so there are these big voters of individual stocks, like retirement plans, either public or private retirement plans, that can influence corporate America policy in these areas because they vote so many shares. Is that what you're kind of up against?
Well, you're totally right. The deck is totally stacked against us from the standpoint of shareholders. But I will say, there are a lot of shareholders that are conservative and religious-minded people. Some of them are in organizations, Christian investment funds, and other kinds of things, who hold, relatively sizable, positions in these companies, and they have every right, just like the folks on the other side of these equations, these issues, to call investor relations, to vote their shares consistent with their values, and to engage these companies on things that matter to them. And that's really what the left-wing activists have been doing for the last 10 or 20 years, at least 20 years. They have been pushing these companies further and further to the left, while the kind of conservative religious movement has said, well, we're never going to lose business. Well, that didn't happen. Us staying on the sidelines when it came to what we were communicating to the C-suites has ultimately resulted in the situation we're in, where the only message they really hear is a message from progressive left-wing activists. So, part of what the Viewpoint Diversity Score project and the Business Index is attempting to do is to provide a different perspective to businesses, to understand that there are, a broad diversity of views represented within their workforce, their customer base, their shareholders. And they ought to avoid taking kind of partisan, narrow political positions on controversial issues, out of respect for the fact that they serve a broad diversity of people.
So what can the public do? Like, what can the people that view this show or that hear of this from other outlets that ADF's working with, what can just the folks that own shares in these companies do?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing you got to do is go to our website, viewpointdiversityscore.org, see if any companies that you hold stock are scored amongst the 50 we scored on the inaugural index. And then, on those ones that you hold stock in, call investor relations and tell them, I want you to pay attention to the Viewpoint Diversity Business Index. I want you to, make changes to get a higher score on that index. I want you to respond to the survey they send out once a year to ask about your internal practices related to these questions, because they're important to me as a shareholder in your company.
Do you think that there's a lot of hesitation because people are afraid of what happens when you actually put your position out there, with the doxing that's going on, even with the Supreme Court? Elon Musk, who has a lot of money, right? He just started getting attacked when he tried to purchase Twitter. Do you think that that's why a lot of people that may be shareholders may be hesitant?
I don't think so. In fact, I think what we're seeing is there's a lot of shareholders that are very unhappy with what corporations are doing, and they're voicing their opinions. There was a survey that came out from Daily Wire just a few weeks ago of investors, and it was very clear that a broad majority across political ideologies did not want corporations engaging in political battles, using the wealth and brand reputation, of these corporations to drive political agendas. They wanted to stay out of those things. They wanted to just focus on doing business and respecting the fact that there's a lot of different points of view represented within their workforce and their customer base, and to not alienate people by these kind of short-term political engagements that aren't going to result in long-term value. So I don't think that really plays a big role here, that sense of fear. And I think also people are seeing that it's making a difference, which tends to beget courage. We see, some of these corporations are starting to get some blowback, Disney and Netflix and others, because they've been going down this one very narrow, woke kind of progressive path. And it's not ultimately good for them in the long run. And they're starting to see that.
I would say Disney kind of jumped off the cliff, and it remains to be seen if they've got a bungee cord to get back up or not. I mean, that was crazy, absolutely crazy.
Well, and then plus they're dealing with the craziness of the release of Buzz Lightyear, right? And all that craziness.
That's been in the works since before they jumped.
Well, I know, but I mean, the newest release of that movie, they've taken a major hit. And I think that goes to what Jeremy is saying, is that people are getting tired of this.
So let me ask you this. So if I check my retirement plan and none of the 50 companies are in my plan because I'm not that good at this, but I can still tell the guys that run my plan without your 50 companies in there that I want them to look at your website because I'm interested in them making sure that the companies that I invest in do participate when you get around to them, whatever. Is that something that's a good thing to do?
Absolutely. The principles that we're advocating as part of this index are principles that cut across all businesses, all industries. So, there's a couple things you can do. One is we've got a whole suite of model policies, practices, guidelines, toolkits that companies can use to kind of measure where they're at on these issues. Does our policy on workplace accommodation, does our policy on, recognizing employee resource groups and all these other things, do they measure up to what these model policies say a Viewpoint diversity score? And, that's something that you can send to the companies you're invested in and say, I'd like you to have good practices when it comes to the issues that are studied on this index. And here's a suite of resources that you can use.
And where would we find
your practices? If you go to viewpointdiversityscore.org and go to the resources tab, they're all right there.
We will make it available too, Jeremy. For those that are watching on YouTube, we'll put the link right there on the bottom. And for those of you that are listening on the radio, make sure that you check out hawaiifamilyforum.org or go and visit us on YouTube so that you can get these links. Thanks, Jeremy.
It seems to me that we sort of were not watching from the time the NFL started having players, they didn't have them, but they allowed the players to take a knee during the national anthem. I wish you guys could have started this back then, because maybe, who knows, but maybe currently we'd be better off. And I'm certainly going to go to that website, look at those materials, grab those resources, and send them to the guy that runs my retirement plan. And I'll let you know if anything actually happens. I mean, it's kind of exciting.
That's great. I appreciate it. Yeah. This is a long-term battle. I think we have to remind ourselves that we got into this position over a 20 or 30-year period of incremental changes in, kind of moving further and further to the left. And these things don't get solved overnight. And one of the things that has been missing, I think, from kind of the conservative, liberty-minded side of this conversation related to C-suites and how businesses operate is, what's the alternative? What's the positive vision for the values and virtues that we care about? Because the left is very good at telling corporations what their, kind of moral high ground is and what they need to do to show that they're doing the right thing as a corporation to be given a high score, or be doing the right thing when it comes to all these different issues. And we've really been missing that. There's a few things out there, but that's really one of the main things that this is trying to fill the void, is businesses that operate in a way that's consistent with our values are businesses that will treat everybody with dignity and respect. They will extend courtesy and respect to people of a broad diversity of views. And they won't take positions publicly on controversial issues that alienate broad swaths of their employees or consumers or the general public. And this is kind of the business culture we need. We need a depoliticized business culture, because what's going on is a lot of activists on the left are weaponizing businesses and private corporations in the culture war. And these businesses, unfortunately, are enabling cancel culture in their business. And so people can easily lose access to, banking privileges, to social media accounts. We all know that. And, because if this continues. So we need to pull them back from the brink and get them committed to viewpoint neutral service provision. And, it's really quite problematic that businesses have these policies with incredibly broad terms that allow them to punish you or deplatform you or cancel you for almost any reason. In those policies, we see them all the time cause problems on social media companies. We know very well about the censorship caused on social media companies' platforms because of those kinds of policies. But the very same kind of policies that cause the problems on social media are also existing in the financial sectors, in the banking sector, and in other sectors we looked at. And so really the censorship time bomb is inside the corporations. And we need to educate them about that being a problem, about how that gives external activists who have no interest in the benefits of in the success of your company a foothold inside your company, and ultimately try to pull them back from the brink on these issues.
So did the 50 companies that are in your index, did that include any of the social media companies?
Yes, all of them. So the big three, Meta, which is Facebook and Instagram, Alphabet, which is Google and YouTube, and Twitter are all on there. And there's a couple others too. Snapchat is on there. Microsoft, of course, a lot of the big tech companies have different really important pieces of the digital communications universe. And so even if they're not social media companies per se, Microsoft's nonprofit pricing policies are hugely impactful on nonprofits. And at ADF, we don't have nonprofit pricing at Microsoft any longer because of all these things we're talking about, because Microsoft is listening to these left-wing activists and saying, well, we're not going to allow nonprofit pricing for organizations that promote ideas that the left disagrees with. Well, that's not a recipe for business success. And it's something that can be turned around and weaponized against the very people who are promoting that kind of censorship. And we don't want to see that at ADF. We want to see depoliticized business services where people have access based on viewpoint neutral terms.
And since we're talking about ADF, I'm going to give you a hypothetical. What condition do you think our country would be in if back when the colonists and the founding fathers were putting the country together, they actually had this kind of woke cancel culture philosophy for the development of this country? I know you've probably never thought about that, but there you go.
We wouldn't have a country right now, would be my guess, because it's a very destructive and toxic philosophy, very corrosive worldview that ultimately leads you to a path of kind of enmity for people who differ from you and disagree with you. And that's not a recipe for a healthy and flourishing society. Who knows what ultimately would have happened? But the things that have made our country so great and so worthy of respect and accolades is our free speech and our religious freedom culture. They are the very distinctive things that have created all the success we have, including the free market success we have, because these things are linked. If you look at studies, countries that have very strong protections and track records of protecting civil rights like free speech and religious freedom, they always have strong economies, strong markets. And the inverse is true as well. If you don't protect those things, you have a weak economy, a destabilized economy. And so, one of the pitches to corporations is it's in your best interest to promote a culture that is at least supports free speech and religious freedom, because you're supporting your own ability to exist and operate within a thriving market, which is what they need as private businesses.
Jeremy, I think it's so fascinating, and we really appreciate that you guys took the time to do this, because I think this is good information. But what I want to do is I want to step from the head for a minute and go down to the heart, because we have a lot of listeners and viewers who might be wondering, who is this Jeremy Tedesco, and why did he go to ADF and give his lawyer talents there, and how did the Lord speak to you to do this work that you're doing?
Wow, that's a great question. So I've been here for 18 years at ADF, for a little over 18 years now. I came here right out of law school. I told my wife when I graduated law school, I'm only going to work for an organization that does free speech and religious freedom work, which basically gave me a couple options. And God was good enough to open the door at ADF. And so I've been here the whole time. I've often told people I can look back on my path and draw a straight line between so many of the experiences I didn't understand why I was going through at the time, but I can draw a straight line between those and the work I do today. And I can really just see God's hand, moving me, teaching me, giving me the lessons and experiences I needed to be able to do what I do today. So it's a story of God's goodness and His grace and His mercy, leading us despite ourselves to the ways in which He wants to use us.
And I'm sure that there's some young people that are listening right now too, and maybe they're considering, going into law school. Can you just speak to them real quick?
Well, law school is an enormous undertaking, and I think you need to be really serious about it. And I think you really need to seek God's will and make sure it's what He's calling you to do. But if He is, it's an incredibly rewarding experience. I litigated First Amendment cases for 15 plus years and still dabble, but now I do a lot of this work I do in corporate engagement. I take all these lessons I learned from litigating First Amendment issues and understanding First Amendment principles, and we're trying to apply them and make them relevant and meaningful to the business culture. So a law degree is a wonderful thing to attain, and a legal career is very rewarding.
So, Jeremy, I've actually enjoyed being an allied attorney of ADF since the late 90s. And I would hope that our viewers and listeners would be interested in supporting ADF. So why don't you tell us how they can become partners with ADF?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jim. And it's adflegal.org. If you go there, it's very easy. If you want to provide funding, we obviously greatly appreciate that. We're a completely donor-based ministry. So adflegal.org, you can easily find where to donate there. But it's also a site that's chock full of information on all the work we're doing. We're right now, along with you all and everybody else in the conservative religious movement, we're waiting for the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs. We ourselves are preparing a case that we're going to be arguing probably at the end of 2022 at the Supreme Court, involving a graphic artist in Colorado who's being forced by Colorado to promote messages about marriage that she disagrees with in the website she designs. And so that's a critical free speech case that's up at the Supreme Court. So, there's just so much going on right now. I invite you to go to adflegal.org.
In fact, that's Colorado. That's the same state government and the same law that the cake baker messed with, and he's still messing with it.
You're exactly right. Masterpiece Cake Shop decided about 5 years ago now, involved the same law. Jack Phillips was sued under that law by two gentlemen who wanted him to create a cake celebrating their same-sex wedding ceremony. He won that case, as you know, and I'm sure your listeners know, 7-2, but they didn't reach the free speech question, the question about whether the government can force you to create speech you disagree with. Masterpiece was decided on religious freedom grounds, and they said that because Colorado had targeted and been hostile to Jack Phillips based on his religious beliefs, that he won the day in court. So our case that's going before the Supreme Court will answer the free speech question most likely, which is whether the government can compel you as a creative professional, as a custom artist, to create artwork that violates your core convictions. And we certainly hope that that's going to be a victory. But you're right, Colorado's been at this for a long time. Jack got sued under this law. Our current client sued Colorado over this law because she feared that they would enforce it against her, just like they did to Jack. And so we're back at the Supreme Court, same state, same law, a little bit different facts, and we're hoping for another win.
So if our viewers and listeners want to keep up with the status on that, because I'm sure our viewers are big time prayers, that's adflegal.org, right?
Yeah, but also our Facebook page. I mean, if you don't follow us on Facebook. We highlight all of our legal work there, and 303 Creative, which is the case I'm talking about, that graphic designer case out of Colorado. We're gonna be talking about that a lot on Facebook for sure, because it's such an important case right now, and so much of what we're doing is focused on winning that case.
Yeah, and for the viewers and listeners who think, well, we're in Hawaii, we don't have those kind of problems. Jim could tell you stories about the cases that he's represented on behalf of ADF right here in the state of Hawaii.
I mean, we have one that's 12 years old where local atheist activists decided that the churches that were using public schools weren't paying enough rent. And that case is still at the beginning of the process after 12 years. So there's a lot of stuff here.
Yes. All right.
But Jeremy, you know what? Thank you very much for the work you did with this index, for joining us on the show today. Please, viewers, follow ADF, Alliance Defending Freedom. It's a legal charity, and we need to support them.
We do want you to plug in not only to the Alliance Defending Freedom, also Hawaii Family Forum and Hawaii Family Advocates. And stay tuned, because the issues are not going to go away. And we're going to be here every day bringing faith, family, and freedom to you. So mahalo, everybody.
Aloha.